who died and now lives forevermore. May we who work and pray that children in the womb may be protected always draw strength, confidence, and joy from your victory over death. For you are Lord forever and ever. Amen.
In Texas, you just don't throw a brat on the grill. As the #1 premium smoked sausage in Texas, we know what Texans like on their table. I'm Mike Kilbasa. Give us a try, and you'll understand why we're the best in the business.
Good evening and welcome to Catholicism Live. I'm Alan Becker and I am delighted to be your host tonight. Catholicism Live, this is a program that's normally sponsored here by the Pilgrim Center of Hope. Deacon Tom and Mary Jane Fox are here at Catholicism Live normally, but we are pleased to have Dr. David Delaney from the Mexican American Catholic College. He's the academic dean there, and we're going to continue our series on theology of the body. Dr. Delaney, welcome again. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you again, Alan. I'm excited to be here tonight.
You bet. Tonight is episode 3, if you've been following us. 2 weeks ago, we talked about episode 1, which was made for greatness. We are made in the image and likeness of God. And as Dr. Delaney explained, we are hylomorphic. We are body-soul composite. And so we as individual persons need to image who God is. And we talked about that a little bit. And if you've got questions on that and want to go back to that, I'll give you the call-in number in a few minutes. And we also talked about last week, we are not just all the same, we are male and female. Again, made in the image and likeness of God, male and female, with an electricity between us.
Yes.
And another word we talked about was complementary
Yes.
or complementarity, I guess is a better word for it. Let's take a couple of minutes to wrap that up a little bit, Dr. Lee. Complementarity, what do we mean by that?
Yes.
The electricity between a male and female.
Yes. Well, as we were talking, we were made for one another. We both have gifts. Maybe back up for a second.
Sure.
We mentioned we were created in the image and likeness of God, and so we can say that we are both human beings as male and female. So we all have everything that it takes to be a human being. When we're saying complementary, we're not saying that each person, a male is a half of a human being,
Right.
a female is another.
Doesn't
half.
lack anything, right?
Right. We all have what it takes, but we have it in such a way that we have a reciprocal attraction to one another.
Right.
Because what I have as a man, I have in such a way that it corresponds to what a woman has in the exactly reciprocal way. And ultimately, we trace that down to the way that we love. That a masculine love is this way of loving and initiating love. And a feminine love is a way of first receiving this love and then returning this love, actively receiving it and returning it. And then the man receives that love. And so the man's primary mode is initiating, actively
Right.
initiating and then receiving, and a woman's complementary way of loving is first receiving and then giving. And this really establishes the structure for the way that we relate to one another, not just as men and women, but as men and women in women as well. And so this complementarity is in this way of loving that we see in its reciprocity is this experience or this sense that oftentimes is referred to as electricity.
Right. Very good. So we start off with us as individual persons. We move to electricity, kind of in the courting stage. And tonight we're going to go into the prenuptial stage, into what this thing is called marriage. And how do we prepare for marriage? So that's our topic of tonight. We're going to talk about made for one another. And that's where we're going to explore. We'd like to thank you and welcome our CTSA listeners here on Channel 15. We want to welcome our KJMA 89.7 FM listeners here in San Antonio. We also want to welcome those who are online on the Guadalupe Radio Network, shortened to grnonline.com. So over the web, we can hear the streamline through that. So thank you and welcome all those who are listening. Please feel free to call in. We'll take calls here in a few minutes. Our number is area code 210-734-5371. That's 210-734-5371. And if you'd rather not call and email us, you can email us at live, L-I-V-E, at Catholic.org. So here is this marriage thing.
Yes.
Marriage is just a human creation. It seems like when we're little, it's just natural people get married to have babies. And that should be the only reason, right? So is it just a human creation to have marriage?
Yes, that's a very good question, Alan. And today the question is very much on a lot of people's minds. There's a lot of confusion about marriage. And marriage is, in fact, for humans, but it's not a purely human creation. In fact, we know from divine revelation that that's certainly the case, though we can see that really that it has to be from nature alone. But let's talk primarily about it from the perspective of divine revelation. I think the first place that I would like to turn is Matthew chapter 19.
Okay.
Matthew chapter 19, if we read in verse 16, Jesus is, this is an exchange, if you will, between Jesus and his disciples. Let me jump into it. It's really the Pharisees and his disciples together. But let's start in verse 16. And behold, one came up to him saying, "Teacher." Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped a little bit ahead.
Probably maybe 3 or 4 there, maybe earlier in the chapter.
Yeah, I think I was getting into
another idea, huh?
Yes.
That happens, David. Your ideas are popping up all over. But
3. The Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female?" And he said, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one, so that they are no longer two but one. What therefore God has joined, let man not put asunder." And so here we see that, in fact, we have God having created us male and female from the very beginning, and the fact that we are called to become one flesh. The two become one, in fact. And so God has created us with this in mind. If we go back to the passage that Jesus is making reference to in Genesis,
Genesis 2:24 would be the one I think that you want. Is the one that I marked in my Bible.
Okay.
Or were you looking at something else?
Yeah, there actually are, two good places. The one, chapter 1, verse 27 is where we're created male and female in his image.
Right.
But this particular reference, you're right, is the 2:24, where the man. I'm not doing very good with my Bible tonight.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and the two become one flesh. This idea of God having created man and woman for one another, and that in fact this is later on he says that in Genesis, the Genesis narrative in chapter 3, we see that there's a purpose for this one flesh union, that is to go and procreate, and to subdue the earth, to multiply and subdue the earth. And so this shows, in a nutshell, really that this relationship that we're called to, and it goes back to what we had talked about before, that we're created in the image of relationship itself. That God in himself is relationship. These persons who are for one another. They're not created, but they are. They exist. They are for one another. Their very being is this relationship. The Father is the Father because of the Son, because he begets the Son. The Son is the Son because of his relationship with the Father, and the Holy Spirit the same. And so we're created in that very image. And so we are created for others, but we're created in a special way for a complementary other. And at root, we have this capacity for procreation, and so we see that. But it extends well beyond that.
And that's where we'd like to get into well beyond that in a few minutes. Just backing up, I can remember seeing weddings on TV. I've been to Catholic weddings. I've been to non-Catholic Christian weddings. And you hear those words, you know, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, and the two shall become one, and let what God has put together, let no man put asunder.
Mm-hmm.
But they become words. And it kind of seems like that's just the institution of marriage. That just simply is some words you say in church. That's just our human ears hearing it. But it's much, much deeper than that. And that's what we want to really get into tonight. It's not just words and an exchange of a contract or an exchange of pleasantries. This is much, much deeper. And
very much so, yes. And in fact, maybe, hopefully I'll get it right this time, but we can see in another text, in Ephesians chapter 5, where we see the depth of that relationship.
Right.
And do you want me to put you on the spot?
Oh, I've got it here. Okay. Ephesians 5, of course, the verse that we as men are going to go right to that says, wives should be subordinate to their husbands. But wait a minute. Let's not start there. Let's back up a little bit. It'll be Ephesians 5:21, which says, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Yes.
So first of all, it's not just the man and the woman there that's on that TV marriage or in that church wedding. It is the man and the woman and Christ. And so we are to be subordinate to one another. And then it says, wives, yes, you should be subordinate to your husband. And husbands, down to 25, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church. And when I explain this to other folks, and I explain it to myself, how did Christ love the church? Well, the epitome of love, Christ died for the church. Husbands, do you love your wives to die for your wife?
Yes.
And you need to be able to say yes to that in order to have that deeper meaning of what that marriage is. So I jumped around there a little bit, but Ephesians 5:21 through 26, mark that in your Bibles, mark that in there, men and women, and really work on that to understand the fruits of your marriage.
Yeah, and there's one other verse that we might want to select out of this. John Paul makes very much of this in his Theology of the Body, Catechesis. In verse 32,
right,
where St. Paul writes, and this is a great mystery. So we're talking about, in fact, marriage. We're talking about Christ and his relationship to the church. And this is what the great mystery is that John Paul refers to. This is a great mystery, and I mean it in reference to Christ in the church. And so this marriage between a man and woman shares in the same mystery as Christ's relationship to his church. And so what you've talked about, you've made reference to that in the two verses that you have mentioned before. But there's a lot of things that we can draw from that. And John Paul basically puts it this way. He says that they're mutually illuminating. This relationship, the marriage is illuminating with authentic marriages, are illuminating with regard to Christ's relationship with his church. But on the other hand, Christ's relationship with the church is very illuminating for what it means in the marriage. The main point that you pointed out is, I think, is fundamental.
Right.
That ultimately the meaning of marriage is shown to us. The meaning of sacramental marriage is this dying to oneself for the sake of the other's sanctification, for the sake of the other's salvation, in a particular way. We can peel that back a little bit, but because of this, because of our relationship with our spouse is built upon the model of it, if you will, is Christ's relationship with his church. Well, what are some certain things that we know about Christ's relationship with the church? Well, how many how many churches does he have?
Right. There's only one head of the church. There's only one bridegroom, and there's only one bride.
Okay, so how many marriages do you think?
Yeah,
that
there's only one.
Exactly.
And until death do this part. And then Christ said that I will never leave you. I will
Exactly.
be with you until the end of the age. So he has one, and it's ongoing. It's irrevocable. It's there.
Exactly.
Christ has made that
irrevocable, I think, is
irrevocable.
the word that comes to my mind as well.
Sure.
So this gives us certain insights because we can see some of the implications. I want to use two words at once here.
Right.
The implications of this, if the relationship were not to be irrevocable,
Right.
if it were only based upon if our purpose in our marriage was our salvation of our spouse, our sanctification of our spouse, only for as long as I felt like it,
Right.
only for as long as she loved me,
Right.
then, well, what do you think that this would mean for our salvation with the cross? How much was the church and continue members of the church to be unfaithful to Christ, his spouse? That doesn't do anything for his that didn't do anything for his commitment to the church,
Sure.
does it?
I guess a quick question that comes to my mind is Christ's reference to the church. I think we can understand with authority, as Christ being head of the church.
Mhm.
I think we can understand as his faithfulness, and there. But what about the subordinate to one another?
Ah, yes.
How is Christ subordinate to his church
okay?
in this relationship?
Okay. I think this idea of, John Paul uses this phrase, I should say, mutual submission, which you read,
okay.
which you backed up to, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Right.
Well, if we were to read through the whole thing, and I won't say that we might not do that, but if we start out, we see that St. Paul is talking about this relationship from the perspective first of men. Women, be subordinate to your husbands, Christ. I think there's about 5 verses that he uses there.
Sure.
You can count them and say that I'm wrong, but
Pretty close.
but then he starts and turns it the other way around. Husband, love your wives. And there's first this idea of obedience, and then he brings up the idea of love. And he has to tell husbands that twice, two times as many
Right.
times. Yeah.
So twice as often he'll
Twice as
explain
often.
that to the husband.
He does. And so we seem to have basically 2 principles of primacy. The husbands seems to be in this having this primacy of authority. But women seem to have another primacy with regard to love that men have to subordinate themselves to.
Right.
And so this is the mutual subordination. The first thing that we probably should take into account is the idea of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Husbands having the idea of authority is in fact the point that of greatest contention that you intimated initially.
Sure.
And this is in fact the issue of what does authority mean? Well, if we read in Matthew 22, I
Tell you
think
while you're reading that, we did have a caller that called in
Okay.
here, David. While you're looking that up, and while I have that thought, Scott is on the line. Scott, what's your question?
Yes, I was curious if Dr. Delaney and y'all could explain the difference between a contract and a covenant and how that relates to marriage. And I will take my answer off the air if that's okay.
That's wonderful, Scott. Well, great. Yeah, contract versus covenant. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Let's complete the thought that we had there, though. But so, Scott, we will probably, you might not get it right before the break, but we'll get it right afterwards. How's that?
Okay.
So
Yes.
now that let's keep the thought going that you had about the authority and submission, because a lot of people get this confused, and I want to make sure that we get this squared away.
Yes, and in fact, in chapter 22 of Matthew, just a couple of verses later, or a couple chapters later, when the disciples are arguing, they're
Right.
arguing essentially after they knew that James and John had wanted to have this position of authority, and Jesus starts talking about what Christian authority really is. And he says it's not like the pagans. Unfortunately, as husbands, we oftentimes fall into that pagan type of idea of authority.
Right.
When we want, because it comes to our it's to our advantage. But authority comes from the author. It is in fact only for the purpose of serving another. This is the reason that we're given authority. Christ says he comes, not to be served, but to serve.
Right.
He has this authority that husbands have in his stead in this marriage. And what is that? It's to serve. The authority there is only for one purpose. And so if it's used for any other purpose, it no longer is authentic authority, it's abuse of power.
Right.
And so if husbands, in fact, authentically use their authority, that for the sake of the salvation and sanctification of their spouses and their family, there would be no danger.
Wow, very good. We'll need to wrap that up a little bit as we go. The authority of a man, I guess we'll go back to what we talked before. Eve was created out of man's rib, out of his side, not out of his head to be above, not out of his feet to be below, but out of his side. And so the authority from the man to the woman, but of a mutual respect and a mutual things on that. Ephesians 5, chapter 5, there is a website, www.e5men.org. Very simple, e5men.org. And women, if you do get on that website, there is a link to an e5womenalso.org. And it explores this Ephesians 5 and has a lot of good articles on it. As we wrap up here a little bit, is marriage just a human creation? I don't think so. We talked all about if Christ in his marriage, and we'll talk about covenant and contract here in a little bit. So, and we think about during the break, when we take this break, is not just for those who are married already, how to make your marriage better, but how, if you're not married, what kind of spouse should I be looking for? What kind of traits? And think about that, and we'll come back here after the break and talk about that. This is Catholicism Live. We're talking theology of the body and marriage tonight. We'll take this break and be right back. Thank you very much.
Attention youth and young adults of the Archdiocese of San Antonio. Did you know that November 30th will soon be upon us? So what, you say? November 30th is the deadline for your application to attend World Youth Day in Madrid, Spain, August 9th through the 22nd, 2011. Don't miss this amazing week-long spiritual journey, including prayer, song, sharing liturgy, and an unforgettable vigil and closing Mass with the Holy Father. Call 210-857-1037 or visit www.wydsa.com for more info.
Hey, this is Owen Wilson.
This is Erica Badu.
I'm Janine Turner.
This is Julius Jones.
This is Lance Armstrong.
This is Leanne Womack.
We're Los Lonely Boys.
This is Chuck Norris.
This is Jennifer Love Hewitt reminding you.
Don't mess with Texas.
Life can challenge us with new problems that can lead to overwhelming stress. These can fracture families, separate, and keep us from having a joyful and productive life. You're not alone. Catholic Consultation Center's mission is to walk this journey with you, using good psychological practice and a spiritual Catholic foundation. Reach out now to Catholic Consultation Center. Let them help you restore hope in your life.
Now we know an unborn baby is a human life. See what we've been missing.
We're talking about theology of the body, talking about marriage tonight. And questions, please call in. Area code 210-734-5371. We had Scott call in, but we're going to wrap up a little bit about Christ and the church and modeling, and we modeling our marriages after husbands and wives, modeling after Christ and the church, to discuss a little bit more about authority versus love. How that works out, Christ's authority and husband's authority, and the mutual love and respect between. Let's wrap that up and then move into covenant.
There's so much we can say, but I think that in a nutshell, what we need to see here is that, and John Paul points this out in his Theology by Catechesis, that the husband has to remember, with regard to authority, that he's not Christ. He's not God.
Right.
He's imaging God in a particular sense, but he's not God. And he does not have what the natural gifts that a woman naturally does have, this capacity for love, experiencing love, and exercising love. And so he has to train himself with regard to love. And so there's this mutuality between the two. And for the husband to be reminded about his authority and his lack of skill in love, he needs to continue pointing himself to the cross to see what love really is.
Right.
Where Christ can say, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do, while he's dying for his unfaithful spouse.
Right.
This is in fact what authority and love are. So the woman ought not, the wife, it's not any woman. It's not a man has authority and a woman doesn't. It's the husband's authority within the family is for the sake of the sanctification and salvation of his family. The woman also has this mutuality in which the husband subordinates himself to her primacy in the order of love. And they both reciprocally and mutually therefore live out the life of Christ by perfecting one another in each of the ways, in each of these ways. And so, go ahead.
Unfortunately, our society doesn't think of it that way and do that way. We think more of marriage as a contract, and even doing prenuptial agreements, saying that, well, if you live up to your end of the bargain, I guess I'll hang with you, but if you don't, I'm out of here. That's kind of a contract, I think is what Scott was getting to.
Yeah.
That's what the mentality is in a lot of people. I'll go into this marriage only if it works out. But that's not the way it should be. Instead of a contract, let's talk about covenant. And I might add into this love and the covenant relationship. Let's explore that and help Scott out in his question.
Yes. Yeah, Scott, thank you for that question. It's critically important. And I think that somebody that we sometimes go back to, and we have on a number of occasions, who has some very pithy ways of presenting these deep insights, Scott Hahn.
Right.
Dr. Scott Hahn, who's a theologian at Franciscan University of Steubenville. He puts it this way. He points out that Scripture scholars, are starting to uncover in the last 40, 50, well, maybe 60 years now of this understanding of what biblical covenants really are. And in a nutshell, we can see that this is the way that family bonds were made beyond biological boundaries.
Right.
You became family. And so the distinction between covenant and contract for him would be in a contract, it's an exchange of goods and services. You say, this is yours and that is mine. In a covenant, it's an exchange of persons. You say, I am yours and you are mine. A contract can be broken, a covenant cannot. A covenant can be violated, but it can never be broken. It is always in existence. And when the covenant is violated, it has to be remedied. There has to be remedies for it, which bring this covenant back into a right order. And so, because it can never be broken, it is eternal. And in one sense, when we're referring to a marital covenant, in the particular aspects, its irrevocability, its exclusivity, its faithfulness in this regard, it exists as long as both are alive. But in a certain sense, what the spouses lived here in this covenant will be what all of us will be living in the eschaton. So it's important, I think, to point out that a marriage doesn't so much go away after we've died. It's fulfilled in its universality, that we all will be living in this covenant with Christ and therefore with one another. It won't be expressed certainly in the same way.
Right.
But it will be lived out in even a much deeper way than we even experienced here on earth.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about, I think we've helped a lot of our listeners here on the radio and over the web, spouses, and to think about husbands and wives there. What about those who are a little younger? We have lots of people. I've got a daughter that's not married yet and a son that's not married yet. What should they look for in their spouses? How kind of key things should we do that? Because marriage is attacked in today's society. Marriage is being scoffed at as, like I said before, prenuptial agreements. Yes. Well, I'll check it out, and I can always throw it away and check out something else, which is not it at all. And so we got to be very, very careful and instruct our young people who are not yet married, looking for marriage, in a couple of ways. Let's explore a couple ideas there and see how that works out.
Sure, yes. Well, as you can see from what we've been discussing here, that it's critically important that both potential spouses understand the reality of, well, the human person,
right?
What sex difference means, and then what marriage means. Because if our potential spouse doesn't share our faith, our Catholic faith, that understands marriage in this way, it's going to be hard enough. It's not. I mean, the intellectual knowledge is a first step, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Sure.
In our culture, which you said attacks marriage, attacks faithfulness and fidelity. I don't remember if you mentioned it, but there's actually a website, I think, out now about that's promoting infidelity. It's promoting adulterous relationships.
Wow.
I think their tagline is "Life is short, so fool around."
Wow.
It's insane.
Right.
But because of this, the potential spouse has to understand this, has to recognize this, and has to believe it. There's no other choice. And
sure. The
second step is that there needs to be a step towards actually being able to live it out. Because, as you know, marriage and family, it's not just that two people are going to suffer. All of society is going to suffer if this marriage that is being contemplated is not perfectly, if it's not successful, if it's not nurturing of the two and of one another, because marriage has ramifications for all of society.
Sure. So I guess one of the things we could say, just to wrap that a little bit, if you're looking for a husband or looking for a wife, if you're out there, first of all, go to the Catechism. Paragraphs 1601 and 1605 is a good start, about a page and a half there. And if we're thinking that this marriage is just a human institution, we'll go right in the middle of paragraph 1603 that says, marriage is not a purely human institution, despite the many variations it may have undergone through the centuries in different cultures. So it is not merely human. Well, if it's not just human, and we see here, what else is there? The well-being of the individual person, and I'm at the end of paragraph 1603 in the Catechism. The well-being of the individual person and of both human and Christian society is closely bound up with the healthy state of conjugal and family life, which is exactly what you were just saying. When we look for a potential spouse, it's not just, well, we ride horses together or we play tennis together, so therefore we have this mutual hobby. We have to look at it as the mutual and the human and the Christian society of just what is our example going to be to Christ and His church, and what is our example going to be to the rest of society.
And it even goes beyond just example. Example is a very important part of it, and you hit on a critical point, because sure. We witness either positively to the gospel or negatively,
right.
And we have negative impacts. But it even goes beyond that. What the Catechism was referring to there with regard to Christian society, the church, we can't have, if we don't have well-formed young men and young women, we don't have priests. We don't have well-formed priests. If they have been damaged, they have so much to overcome, they can't be well-formed priests or well-formed. It can damage them for life. And why is that the case? Well, and why is it that we're seeing so many problems in society? Well, the family is the building block, if you will, right. the basic fabric of a society. And what is it that happens in a family? Well, a child within a family has to learn how to live with one another. You know, as you see children growing up, as little infants, they are totally enwrapped in themselves.
Sure.
As you see them growing up and to become children, you can see them very slowly being able to see the difference between themselves and the outside world. that the world doesn't completely that doesn't completely revolve around them. When you see your child first sharing something,
right,
it starts warming your heart as a parent. In a child being able to express love in a self-giving way, a selfless way, we start to see this progress being made. The child learns to be in a society in the family. The family has to be able to love that child. And it's almost a womb, if you will. The family is almost a womb, a nurturing womb where the child learns to trust.
Sure.
Trust is a fundamental aspect of society. Children that don't learn this trust, when the parents aren't trustworthy, and we'll talk about this next week, if the trusting bonds, or the bonds that the child learns to trust in, dissolve, the child's capacity for trust, not just within an intimate relationship, but within society itself, becomes damaged.
Right.
And as the bonds, the capacity to trust one another and to give ourselves to the other for their own sake, die or diminish, the fabric, it begins in the family, but it's almost like looking at a cloth that has started to fragment. From a distance, it might look fine, but as you get closer, you start to see the threads have become destroyed, decrepit, and they're starting
holes in there. Yes.
Yeah, and they're starting to come apart, and that's kind of what we're seeing now. The family has been in free fall since the 1960s. This is what some sociologists of family have been saying. The nuclear family has been in free fall, and so what we are seeing now is the ill fruits of that at the societal level. So the capacity or the importance of teaching our children about what it is to look for in a spouse is fundamentally important, because family is fundamentally important. Society depends upon it.
Sure. So as that child grows and as they learn, and hopefully in a good family, a mother and a father in the nuclear family, they need to mature. And they need to mature emotionally as well as spiritually. And we started off spiritually right away, because if it's just human, it's not just human. You have to work in that spiritual. And that maturity has to take some work. It takes some work on part of the parents to teach, as well as the child to learn. And so this doesn't come automatic. It takes a little bit of time, doesn't it?
It does. There's an emotional maturity.
Right.
An emotional maturity is in some sense, it's a human acquisition. The emotional maturity means that you have some level of self-mastery, that you're not totally driven by your emotions.
Right.
That you can that you can control yourself sufficiently that you can see whether or not these emotions are reasonable. It begins with selfishness, overcoming selfishness, but even the way you react to what is maybe even a just response initially to an injustice between you and other people, but to be able to put that into context, to be able to overcome that and forgive the other. Without emotional maturity, intimate relationships are difficult at best and impossible at worst. But also spiritual maturity. Maturity, and sometimes spiritual maturity, in fact, spiritual maturity and emotional maturity go together. And sometimes to overcome damage that has kept this emotional maturity from progressing, you need supernatural strength.
Right.
And so you need to be making very much progress in spiritual maturity as well as emotional maturity. And so your potential spouse, you want to be able to have access to that grace. They want to have, and what's the normal access to grace? Within the sacramental system. So you want you want your spouse to be a practicing Catholic who's on fire about their faith, who has started overcoming the brokenness, the hurts, in developing self-mastery for emotional maturity, as well as spiritual maturity, the holiness without which none of us will see God, the holiness without which we will not be able to overcome the slights and the affronts that our spouses, that we will necessarily experience with our spouses. This is something that we have, so it takes the knowledge And then it takes movement, action towards this. And this is something that I think that it's a very hard thing to present, because, and I can tell you, I mean, I may be a little bit old, but I can still remember the the emotional response that you get, the infatuation of being in love.
Sure.
And how difficult it is to be able to see that these things in a potential spouse aren't going to be, they're not going to be overcome, at least not easily, just by the emotional attachment that we have for one another. That it's going to take something much greater.
Well, how do potential spouses, or the young man and the young woman looking at each other, how do they measure this maturity? How do they understand that? Now, of course, going to church and that's a physical or ways to see that, but how do they get to work this out? What's the key to make sure that can happen? They can share that back and forth.
Well, I think that it seems to me the first step is being clear that the other person understands and wants it.
Right.
That's the very first step. That there is a real commitment to what a lifelong, unity really means in the marital covenant. The next step, though, I think, is really looking at how that person lives, how that person, if that person can't live this, if that person, the potential spouse, lives a very schizophrenic life,
right,
then and says the right things, but in their actions can't even come close to living it out, and doesn't seem to be making an effort and trying, then I think that there's
good indicators there.
Yeah,
yes.
And the sage wisdom is that when you get married, at that point in time, you have to accept your spouse for the way that they are.
Sure.
And you can't expect that things are going to get better later.
Right.
And so you have to go into it with your eyes open, and you have to recognize that when you get married, you're going to pray for your spouse, and you're going to try to do everything you can to make your spouse, help your spouse become holy. But you can't expect that that's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, you have to be ready to live the rest of your life in what might be a lot of suffering.
Right. Well, I think how to get to know that, and you could see that manifest and get it going. And we talk a lot about communication and work in today's society. Oh, gee, the communication's easy. You can text, you can Twitter, you can email, of course my communication is good.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. What is that? That's using a medium to make your decisions for you. I think there's a very, very big danger here where the communication to get to know the maturity level, to get to understand the spirituality, to get to understand the emotion, there is nothing like sitting down, holding hand to hand and looking each other's eyes and explaining who they really are.
Yes.
We have to take this computer away, we have to take the phone away, but that has become our way of communicating. And I think it's a big danger. And so if they do nice texts and have happy faces, well, then it's going to be happy face no matter what we do. And so it's kind of a danger, don't you think, in that area?
It's a very great danger. These virtual relationships actually give the illusion of intimacy, but they don't have actual intimacy.
Sure. And so what happens, and I'll give you the end here, we're going to wrap up a little bit for a break, but that's what happens if we just communicate and keep doing that, then I'm getting it, and I'm being selfish and say, well, okay, I'll go into this marriage, and I'll go back to prenuptial again, and we can come back, we talk about that a little bit. How do we work in this happy marriage with all of the world going back and forth? Right before we take the break, though, I do want to make an announcement here so we don't have so many at the end. This is Catholicism Live, and we're talking about marriage tonight using Theology of the Body from Pope John Paul II. Check out Mr. Alan Ames is in San Antonio here from the 11th to the 19th, starting tomorrow night and through next week. If you get on the Archdiocese website, www.archsa.org, or you look in Today's Catholic, you'll see the parishes that Mr. Ames is at. And if you want to know more about that, you can email us at live@catholic.org, and I will email you back his schedule. So I wanted to make sure I got that out, that's happening. Several other things are happening in our Archdiocese, and we would love to tell you about that. Please call in with a question for tonight or anything else going on, 210-734-5371. This is Catholicism Live. We're going to take a break and be right back. Thank you.
Mission San Juan Capistrano is one of the early frontier missions of San Antonio and part of the largest concentration of Spanish colonial architecture in the United States. Mission San Juan was established in 1716 to serve the Nazone Indians of East Texas. In 1731, the mission moved to San Antonio along the east bank of the San Antonio River. It became known as San Juan Capistrano. The Franciscan missionaries built the mission settlements in service to the cross and the crown. They served as explorers for the Spanish crown and missionaries for the Catholic Church. In its early years, San Juan struggled to survive. There was much suffering among the Indians with disease and bands of raiding Apaches and Comanches. Still, the mission persevered. In 1762, approximately 200 Indians lived at Mission San Juan. They farmed and created iron tools. The mission was once completely self-sustaining and supplied food for the other missions and the community. An unfinished church is part of the setting on the mission grounds. In 1772, it was an effort to renovate the east side of the mission compound. The project was never completed, but the beautiful old church stands and is an active parish in the Archdiocese of San Antonio. Generations of inhabitants of Mission San Juan continue to pray and visit the mission grounds, just as their ancestors did centuries ago.
Hello, my name is Father David Garcia, Archdiocesan Director for the Old Spanish Missions, inviting you to participate with us in Las Misiones campaign, an effort to restore, preserve, and maintain these beautiful cultural and historical treasures of our city, our state, and our nation. These missions are deteriorating at a rapid pace, and we need your help. Please call us, write us, or visit our website. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Welcome back. This is Catholicism Live. I'm Alan Becker, hosting here Dr. David Delaney from the Mexican American Catholic College. And we want to get right back to our topic of marriage. A couple of things first, though. For the Pilgrim Center of Hope, get on their website, www.pilgrimcenterofhope.org. And you'll see there several things that are happening. One I want to highlight is November 20th at the Omni Hotel Ballroom is the fundraiser for luncheon fundraiser for the Pilgrim Center of Hope. And none other than Patrick Madrid will be there to talk. Why be Catholic when you could be anything else? Why be Catholic from Patrick Madrid, Pilgrim Center of Hope, all one word, .org, or you can call them at 210-521-3377. That's at the Pilgrim Center of Hope. We want to thank Deacon Tom and Mary Jane Fox, who have been on pilgrimage, and they're completing their pilgrimage very soon. We're very indebted to them to be here talking about theology of the body, and thank them for giving us the opportunity. We talked a little bit about how we can understand marriages already for people who are married. We talked a little bit about potential, the people that are looking to be married, how to look at things. But we want to get into a little bit deeper now, this feeling, this thing called love. I think the word love is so misused in our society today. Let's wrap that around and help both married couples and those who are looking for marriage on what authentic love really means.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit, Dr. Delaney, please?
And that's a very important point because it's so misunderstood. Love has taken on meanings, as you said, from pure emotion. Sometimes it's equated simply with a genital act.
Right.
These are great perversions of really what authentic love is. Authentic love is more than just emotion, a second-hand emotion even. It's, in fact, emotions, though, can go with it and do go with it. But it's important to realize that the emotions are a fruit of authentic love and not to be equated with love. One of the things that we have to recognize then is that the emotions as fruits are going to change. Initially, the emotions are going to be associated with, when we start first experiencing this love with someone that we haven't experienced it with before, are going to be euphoric.
Sure.
They're going to be very feelings of novelty and being reaffirmed in a way that one hasn't been reaffirmed before by someone that we haven't been reaffirmed from before. And so these emotions, though, are in general relatively superficial. It's not that they're bad. And in fact, God has given them to us so they're good because it's reaffirming some good things that can be happening. But we have to be very careful in our fallen state not to assume that if these emotions change or we experience them in a different way, that love has disappeared. So what is authentic love? Authentic love, and there are manifold aspects to it. There an attraction. There can be a love of attraction. And this love of attraction is a first step into love. But even that is not authentic love. It can go with authentic love, and it should go with authentic love, this erotic love, which means this love going out of oneself for another. But even there we don't find the root of love, of authentic love. The root of authentic love, we have to go back and think about the greatest commandment.
Right.
The greatest commandment is what? Love
God.
Yes, with our whole heart, our whole mind, our whole soul, our whole self, and our neighbor as ourself. Well, what is that? How can we be commanded to love? Well, if it's just an emotion, well, we can't. We know we can't turn our emotions on and off. So at root, love has to be associated with the intellect and the will.
Sure.
We can only be asked to do something if we have the capacity as humans to do it. And the things that we have control over, direct control over, is our intellect and our will.
Right.
We can train our emotions, and we should train our emotions to subordinate themselves, to behave in accord with the way that we think and we will. But sometimes that's a very long process, and if we're very broken, we might not ever completely get there. And so we can't always rely on or trust our emotions. Sure. We have to look at them or judge them in light of our intellect and our will. So one chooses to love. What does that mean? Well, that means you never fall in love in the authentic sense, and you never fall out of love in the authentic sense. You choose to love, and if you stop loving, it's because you choose to.
Right.
You can lose these emotions that you had, but you can also get them back. But you have to, and oftentimes it's these small imperceptible choices that you've made that have caused those feelings to wane or to die.
Sure.
And just like you've caused them to die by these small imperceptible choices, you can get those feelings back. You can train those feelings to become real again. And so this is critically important in marriages, because a marriage is possible in this society, in our fallen society. A loving marriage, a marriage full of life and love for one another. But we have to recognize that we aren't, we're not, subject to fate.
Right.
To whether Cupid continues, slinging us with its arrows or not.
Sure.
That we have the choice, either for or against.
Right. Well, there's many helpful tools out there to use, and the first comes in mind as you talk about that is Marriage Encounter.
Yes.
And many people have done that and could do that again and continue that love is a choice, as you said. Love is a decision. And you have to make sure that you're thinking of the right decisions and the right choices there. Another great tool that we have, again, we'll put out websites here, is here in San Antonio and all over, the Alexander House.
Yes,
www.thealexanderhouse.org. And the Alexanders are experience of that they were making a choice not to keep their marriage, that their choices was, this is not going to work. And then they said, wait a minute, why did God put us together in the first place?
Yes.
And so themselves turned their own marriage around and have helped countless number of people turn themselves around. The authentic love that they have, the choices that they have to try to get over that feelings of selfishness and that feelings of, well, if I don't like it, I can get out of here. No, you made that commitment. You didn't make a contract. You made a covenant with your spouse. And so you are there, can't do it alone, but with God's grace, try to work through that. And there are many tools and many help to work that marriage. The last thing, a little bit, as we wrap up a fast hour here tonight, is the goals. Yes. If our goals in marriage is to be happy, and that you make me happy, I think we have the wrong goal. What do you think?
No, that's exactly right, Alan. If one pursues the happiness as a goal for marriage, one ends up treating one's spouse as a means to an end.
Right.
The spouse has to be an end. The spouse is good. the good of the spouse itself. Their salvation and sanctification has to be the end. Happiness then will be a fruit.
Sure.
It will be a fruit that comes. Not even if the spouse doesn't reciprocate, one can still experience happiness by being faithful oneself, by giving oneself to the other for their own sake, by authentically living what the meaning of marriage is.
Wow, we could go into this a lot because marriage is not always happy, it's not always pleasure, but it is always loving, and so we got to make sure we do that. And as we have a few minutes to go, we're going to need to talk about our saint of the week. And it's today's feast day on November the 10th is Pope Leo the Great. Now the Great, that brings, now how did Pope Leo get that to great? Pope Leo was the very first to have the name Great. Pope Leo reigned as a pope from 440 to 461, very early in the church. There's two other popes that were called the Great, Pope Gregory I in 590 to 604, and then Pope St. Nicholas the Great, 858 to 867. And with this theology of the body, once in a while we talk about Pope John Paul II being the Great. Well, what was so great about Pope Leo? Well, in the early 400s and in the middle 400s, the church was in a lot of persecution, and there were a lot of heresies. And so Pope Leo was very strong in the Catholic faith, understood what Christ taught the apostles and what he carried on, and stood up not only spiritually and was a leader, physically he was a leader. Pope Leo courageously stood up to Attila the Hun. Now, I remember our history lessons there. Attila the Hun was one mean man and one ferocious man, but Pope Leo stood up to him and saved Rome from being sacked. And for this reason, Pope Leo was called the shield of God. So in times that we are thinking of being attacked in our marriages, being attacked in our relationships, being attacked, saying we need to have the shield of God. We need to have someone like Pope Leo that's strong in order to help us in our marriages and in our relationships. We also have a pearl of the week, Dr. Delaney, The Covenant of Love, Pope John Paul II on Sexuality, Marriage, and Family in the Modern World. What a great book right now to have someone get a hold of. Give us a short synopsis of the book, if you will, please.
Yes, Father Hogan's the author of that. I forget the second author, the sub-author, but basically he's gone throughout all of his writings, not just theology of the body, but all of his writings, and helped draw together the great wisdom that John Paul has for us about the meaning of human sexuality and marriage, the great gift of covenant that is, that God has given to us.
Great, great. So he put a couple other things besides theology of the body. Well, made for one another. Marriage is what we had talked about tonight. And those preparing for marriage. Remember what love really is. It's a choice and a decision. Remember that you're not looking for just happiness. You're not looking for a nice tennis partner for the rest of your life. Although tennis is important, don't let me pick on that. But you're looking for much, much more than that. Yes. You're looking for mutually self-giving to each other to help each other in the next life to get to heaven. And that's the goal of the marriages. We're going to talk more about marriage, and we'll talk about the difficulties of marriage. Why is there divorce? The next week we'll talk about I do for a while. And we're going to see what Pope John Paul II talks about theology of the body in this talk of divorce today. And we talk about, maybe we can talk a little bit about annulments. Is that the Catholic divorce? And we hear lots of things going on there. So as we go through the day and as we start learning who we are and where we are made for greatness. We have an electricity of male and female. We are made to love as Christ loved his church. But we are broken in a difficult society today. How we can help this divorce, how we can help this marriage. Dr. Delaney, it's been a pleasure. Looking forward to next week again. Thank you very much from the Mexican American Catholic College. And thank you all our KJMA listeners and all the folks on www.grn online. Tune in next week on Catholicism Live. And we will keep you in our prayers, and we ask for your prayers for us. Have a great evening and good night. God bless you.
Texas, sausage making is a time-honored craft. That's why we don't add monosodium glutamate, phosphates, and other hard-to-pronounce ingredients into our sausage. Hi, I'm Mike Kilbasa. Read our label, and you'll understand why we're the best in the business.